Wel, prynhawn da unwaith eto I chi gyd. Today I'm here as ever to update everyone on the outcome of the latest 3-week review of the coronavirus regulations, and then to look ahead at how we can keep Wales safe and keep Wales open during the months ahead. 3 weeks ago when I was last here, the number of people falling ill with coronavirus was rising every day in Wales. Now that trend continued into the first half of this 3-week cycle, and it resulted in the highest levels of new cases of coronavirus that we have seen throughout the whole of the pandemic. The rise was largely driven by very high numbers of infections in younger people, the rates in the under 25s being around 4 times higher than the rates in people aged 60 and over. In more recent days, the numbers have started to fall back to below 500 cases per 100,000 people, but that is still very high. Now, at the same time, we've seen some reductions in the number of people in hospital with COVID-19, but the NHS and social care continues to be under immense strain from non-pandemic and emergency pressures. I'd like to ask everybody today to think about how we can support our National Health Service, thinking carefully about the care we need, and going to an accident and emergency department should never be the first or only choice for every health problem. Now this week, having closely examined all the indicators and taking the advice of our scientific and medical advisors, the Cabinet has decided that Wales will remain at alert level 0. This means that there will be no substantial changes to the rules over the next 3 weeks beyond those already announced. Now that of course includes the COVID pass, which will become a legal requirement from Monday for certain venues and events. Everyone aged over 18 will need to show a COVID pass or proof of a negative lateral flow test if they are entering a nightclub or similar venue, indoor non-seated events for more than 500 people, outdoor non-seated events for more than 4,000 people, and any event where there is more than 10,000 people present. Now, while there are no substantial new changes, the Education Minister has set out this week new measures to help schools and colleges minimise disruption for staff and students. And as from today, we will make it easier for a loved one to be visited in a care home. Now, care homes and care home visiting have been amongst the most challenging issues during the pandemic. From today onwards, care home providers will have the discretion to allow visitors to take lateral flow tests at home rather than at the care home itself. They will no longer have to ask visitors to socially distance when making a visit to a resident's room or in a designated visiting room, and restrictions around gifts, including food and drink, will also be eased. And if we can, we will always look for opportunities to make people's lives easier while also keeping Wales safe. I want now to turn to the autumn and the winter months that lie ahead. This slide shows the results of the modelling work carried out for us by Swansea University. This is the most likely scenario that the model offers us. It takes into account how people mix, vaccine immunity levels, and how the Delta variant is behaving. The dotted blue line tells us how the model suggested the Delta wave would work itself out in Wales, and the thick black line shows what actually happened in terms of the number of cases reported. And as you can see, the model has proved so far remarkably accurate in predicting the way this wave of coronavirus would happen here in Wales. We've tracked the model very closely, and as you can see, cases have started to reduce again in Wales as the model would have predicted. And if we continue to track the model in the way we have over recent times, then we will see those numbers continuing to reduce over the weeks ahead. Now, although that means that the modelling forecasts look positive, coronavirus has not gone away and the pandemic is not over. Our medical advisors are concerned about higher levels of flu this winter, as well as increases in other respiratory viruses. Today, we have published an updated coronavirus control plan, which sets out how we will keep Wales safe and keep Wales open over this challenging period. There are three main ways in which we will do this: through vaccination, through our test, trace, protect system, and through the basic but essential measures we all take in our everyday lives to protect one another. Now, I'll start with the first of those three defences, vaccination, because vaccination remains the single most important defence against the virus. Our autumn COVID-19 booster programme started at the end of last month. So far, around 130,000 people have already received their booster. Vaccinations for 12 to 15-year-olds have accelerated this week, and the feedback from vaccination centres so far has been very positive. Every day, more people in Wales are taking up their offer of vaccination, and it's never too late to be vaccinated in Wales. If you haven't had your COVID vaccine yet, you can make arrangements to have it in one of many centres right across Wales, and the details are there for you on our website and on the websites of our local health boards. Next week, the Health Minister Eluned Morgan will publish an updated vaccine strategy, setting out plans and timescales for the programme in the coming months. Now, the second line of defence is our test, trace and protect service, which has played a crucial role in keeping us safe. I want to thank all those people who have come forward to be members of our TTP teams for the vital work they do. You have helped to slow the spread of the virus time and again over the recent period. And we will need your support again over this winter. Our advice about testing if you have symptoms is not changing. Get a PCR test if you have symptoms. If it's positive, stay at home and isolate. This is the best way to break the chain of transmission. Now, we've recently seen very high numbers of people coming forward for PCR tests in Wales, up to 190,000 people in a single week at the end of September. If the level of demand grows still further, we'll have to make some choices about how we respond to that demand, and we're working closely with the rest of the United Kingdom to put those plans in place. And our updated coronavirus control plan also shows how we will use our TTP capacity to best effect if those numbers too go on rising. Now, the third and final set of measures that help to keep us safe from coronavirus are those very practical things we have all learnt to do and to do successfully throughout the pandemic. Washing hands regularly, keeping a social distance, wearing a face covering in crowded public places, working from home wherever possible, meeting people outdoors where possible, and keeping indoor spaces well ventilated. If we keep doing these things and doing them together, then we can keep Wales safe and keep Wales open during this winter. A diolch o galon I chi gyd am popeth chi'n parhau I wneud. I'll now take questions from journalists in the usual way, and all the answers will be broadcast live on the Welsh Government's social media platforms. And first today, over to ITV Wales.
Hello, First Minister. It's Phrif Weinidog here from ITV Wales. First of all, what level of infection would be the tipping point for greater restrictions? You mentioned that we've got to below 500 per 100,000 cases at the moment. Is that the kind of ballpark figure that you're looking at?
Well, Sianprita, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for the question. I'm afraid that as we go into this winter, it's just not possible to give a simple figure that answers the question. This time last year, when the health service was essentially dealing with coronavirus, it was easier to say, as our control plan said at the time, if you get to a certain number, then certain actions will follow. This winter is significantly more complicated. We will be, of course, dealing with coronavirus, but the health service is at the same time incredibly busy dealing with all the other things we ask it to do, trying to catch up on treatments which were delayed earlier in the pandemic, and of course responding to whatever happens in the flu season as well. For all those reasons, it's just not possible to say that a certain level of coronavirus alone would trigger a certain set of actions. It will be a judgment in the round about all the different things that the health service is having to respond to.
Brilliant, thank you. And in terms of vaccinations, you mentioned how vital they are. Have we reached the level of vaccinations that you were hoping for pre-winter?
Well, we certainly have amongst the higher end of the age ranges, people in care homes, staff and health service staff. Numbers are still rising in people aged under 30. We're almost at 80% now of people in their 30s. We're close to 80% of people in their 20s. I'd like us to get to 80%. I'd like us to get just that bit further up. We've got over 70% of people aged 16 and 17 who've already been vaccinated. So the numbers continue to be good, and the vaccine programme in Wales continues to be a success. There's more to do, both in the booster campaign and in persuading people at that younger end of the age range that coronavirus could mean them. You know, that nobody is immune from it. Vaccination is just as important if you're in your 20s as if you're in your 70s. And the more people who come forward for it, the safer we will all be. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much. Draw I Cemlyn Davies, BBC Wales.
Diolch, Phrif Weinidog, and I'd be grateful if you could answer these questions in Welsh as well as English. Can people in Wales now, do you think, look forward to what they might describe as a normal Christmas?
Well, the model that I showed earlier and the most likely scenario in our control plan says that we ought to be able to get through the autumn and the winter with restrictions at the sort of level we have at the moment. And that would be very different to last Christmas, far more like the sort of Christmases we were used to. All that does depend, as I said in my opening statement, on us all doing the things that keep us safe. Coming forward for vaccination, flu vaccination as well as coronavirus vaccination, and the simple things that we've learned to do together. Then, if nothing unexpected arises, and we've got to plan for the unexpected as well, then we can look forward to a Christmas much more like the ones that we're used to. So beth mae'r y cynllun yn dangos yw, a ffordd ymlaen fwy debygol yw yr un ble ni gallu edrych at y Nadolig gyda cyfyngiadau sydd mwy na lai yn yr un lle maen nhw yn heddi. Mae hwnna'n dibynnu ar ni gyd i wneud pethau ymarferol, dod ymlaen am y brechiad, i dod ymlaen am y frechiad yn erbyn y ffliw hefyd, ac i parhau i wneud y pethau bach, golchi dwylo, pellter cymdeithasol, defnyddio mwgawdau ac yn y blaen. Os ni yn i gyd yn wneud pethau fel na, a'r model ni wedi dangos heddi yn dysgu, allwn ni edrych ymlaen am Nadolig lot fwy fel Nadolig oeddwn ni wedi weld cyn coronavirus. Wrth gwrs, mae'n pwysig hefyd i'r Llywodraeth i cynllunio am pethau ni ddim yn disgwyl digwydd. So os mae amrywiolyn newydd yn dod i fewn i'r Adeilad Senedig, neu os mae'r brechllyn ddim yn rhoi imiwnydd fel mae'n wedi rhoi i ni ar hyn o bryd, wel wrth gwrs mae'r cynllun yn dangos sut ni'n paratoi am hynny hefyd.
Diolch. And on COVID passes being introduced on Monday, how confident are you that you've got the message out there, that people know what they need to do and that the process is as easy as it can be? Is there a risk that perhaps all this has been rushed?
Well, I said 3 weeks ago here that we will be introducing the COVID pass on the 11th of October. And the reason for doing it was so that it wouldn't be rushed, so that the sector and people who use those venues that I outlined earlier, that they had more than 3 weeks to prepare for the fact that this would be becoming mandatory here in Wales. Thousands of people in Wales have used the COVID pass already. Many venues have used it already. And for those reasons, I think we can have some confidence that it will be a relatively smooth passage into it. I'm not going to say that there won't be individual examples of teething trouble. No doubt they will be, and the system will be understanding of any organisation or venue which is doing its best to get everything in place and just needs a little bit more time to make sure that that happens. But I think that the system is easy to use. There are 3 different ways in which you can show what you need. You can do it online, you can do it on paper, you can do it by taking a lateral flow test and getting a text message or an email to confirm the result. So the fact that thousands and thousands of people have been able to do it already and to do it very successfully suggests to me that the system does work and that it'll go on working. So just either way, dwedais I tair wythnos yn ôl o y bwriad yw I wneud y pas Covid yn orfodol o'r dydd Llun nesaf. So mae bobl wedi cael fwy na tair wythnos I paratoi ac I clywed am y cynllun. So dwi'n meddwl bydd y system yng Nghymru wedi cael digon o amser I paratoi. Mae'n haws I defnyddio, mae'n mwy nag un ffordd I dangos chi wedi wneud beth bydd yn angenrheidiol I chi wneud. Chi'n gallu wneud e ar-lein, chi'n gallu wneud e ar papur, chi'n gallu wneud e trwy cymryd profiad lateral flow. A mae miloedd o bobl yng Nghymru wedi wneud hwn yn barod ac yn wedi wneud e yn llwyddiannus hefyd. So, I fi, ni wedi paratoi, ni wedi wneud y penderfyniad I defnyddio system mae pobl yn gyfarwydd gyda'r system ac hefyd system sy'n yn rhoi fwy o help I bobl I warchod bobl yn erbyn coronavirus. Cemryn, diolch yn fawr. Over to Bronwen Weatherby at PA.
Prynawn da. England is said to be scrapping the PCR test by the end of the month for people travelling to England from abroad. Will Wales be following England in getting rid of the PCR test regime for travellers?
Well, I'm very concerned at what we are hearing from the UK government about its plans to abandon PCR tests. We don't have any detail from them. We don't know how the lateral flow devices will be deployed in their place. And here are the reasons why I'm anxious about it. When you take a PCR test, the results get fed automatically into the patient record, and we are able here in Wales, because we have some of the best genetic sequencing capacity anywhere in the world, to check those results for new variants that may be emerging in other parts of the world. It is not clear to me at all how lateral flow tests can be used in the same way. Now, the UK government created a market for PCR tests where people could buy them in the private market. It turned out very quickly that quite a large number of suppliers in that market weren't providing a product that was reliable. The UK government had to remove over 90 suppliers from its approved list. Are they now to create a new market in lateral flow devices? And how confident can we be that the supply of lateral flow devices will be genuine and will be reliable insofar as they can be used? There are an awful lot of unanswered questions in what the UK government is said to be proposing, and every one of them seem to me to be a risk that we are lowering the protections that we have against the importation of new viruses that may be emerging in other parts of the world. It is very difficult for us not to follow what the UK government does in the area of international travel, because the vast bulk of people who make journeys overseas, who live in Wales, do so from ports and airports outside Wales. They return to those airports. The regime that's in place will be the English regime. And I think our energies have been focused on trying to persuade the UK government not to erode the safeguards that we think are properly in place to check that we're not all going to be put at risk in a way that need not happen.
Thank you. And the second question, a new father who's double vaccinated can wet the baby's head with his friends in a nightclub in Wales as long as he downloads the NHS COVID pass. Yet the same father is banned from visiting his partner and newborn baby if they're admitted to a postnatal ward within the Cwmtaf Health Board area. Whereas in Hywel or Cardiff and Vale, for example, limited visiting is allowed. Do you think that's right? And are you doing anything to address this apparent inequality facing families in Wales?
Well, I think there's two different questions there. First of all, the context between visiting a nightclub and going to a hospital is entirely different. Hospitals full of people who are inevitably vulnerable because they are unwell, and where the reimportation of the virus into hospitals is something our health service is working really hard to try to prevent. Cwmtaf took their decision because they had the highest rates anywhere in Wales, and therefore there was even more virus in circulation in the community there than, for example, in the Hywel area. And therefore the risks that somebody coming in from the community, even for really important visits, and I don't for a minute, downplay the importance of families being able to be together at the time of the birth of a new child. But any visitor in from the community, when the rates were so that high, posed a risk that they would bring coronavirus with them. That is why Cwmtaf took the decision, and they were in a different position to some other health boards. So I've no doubt that they will wish to start allowing visits again as soon as they think that it is safe to do so. And the risks involved to the people who are there are very different to the risks involved in people going to a nightclub with a lot of other very healthy young people who've chosen to do the same thing. Bronwyn, diolch yn fawr. Over
Thank
to
you.
GB News.
Thank you, First Minister. Firstly, the Welsh Labour and Plaid Cymru party conferences have been cancelled for this year because of concerns about the virus spreading. But Wales remains at alert level 0, where big events like these can go ahead. Why can't these conferences take place if the public can safely go to sports events and concerts, and now even go to care homes without social distancing?
Yeah, the Labour Party, I can only speak for the Labour Party took the decision on the basis that our conference is an entirely voluntary activity, and that we shouldn't add to the risks that are in Wales already. So, the Labour Party conference in Wales is a big event. Hundreds of people come to it. They travel from all parts of Wales. They are inevitably inside an enclosed space together for conference purposes. We plan our conference for next year in March, so it's only 4 months from November to March. And weighing all those risks up together, we came to the decision that it was better to avoid adding to the risks that there will be there over the winter, and that waiting until March for our conference was not an unreasonable thing to do as far as the party was concerned.
Thank you. And secondly, there'll now be consequences for people who fabricate these lateral flow tests, which are being used for the NHS COVID passes. How exactly are they going to be caught by the authorities?
Well, I think, we thought long and hard about this. Lateral flow devices are, we know, vulnerable to people misreporting the results. I don't think that happens on a large scale in Wales, because I think most people in Wales who go to the trouble of taking a lateral flow test are genuinely trying to make sure that they are keeping themselves and others safe. But if people deliberately try to misreport the results into the system, then we think it's right that they know that there is a penalty for them. And it will be caught up through the normal ways in which the passes will be supervised, and people, if people knowingly and deliberately set out to put other people at risk, then we think it is right they know that. That isn't a cost-free course of action here in Wales. Lily, thank you very much indeed. Over to Abby Whittick at Wales Online.
Good afternoon, First Minister. Just going back to the PCR tests, you say that we've seen incredibly high numbers of people coming forward for these, and that if this grows, you need to make choices to deal with demand. Could you give a bit more detail on what kind of choices are being looked at, and what are the options for limiting PCRs? I mean, might certain groups be diverted to lateral flow tests?
Yeah, no, well, thank you, because I think you've probably answered the question. So nobody in Wales during the winter will be told they can't have a test. It's just that if we reach a situation where there are more people coming forward for testing than the PCR system can manage, then we will do it, not on a first come, first serve basis, but on the basis of making sure that our PCR tests are being used for the most vulnerable populations first, the most vulnerable settings, and then some people who are in the less vulnerable groups will be offered a PCR test, a lateral flow test in the first instance. If they are positive for a lateral flow test, then they will be offered a PCR test to follow it up. Now, we've never reached a day where we couldn't offer a PCR test to everybody who wanted one, but we are just making a plan in case, in the depths of the winter, when there might be a lot of flu about and it's hard to distinguish the symptoms of flu and coronavirus. If we came to a day when we couldn't offer everybody a PCR test, we'd still be offering everybody a test. But people in the lower risk categories, some people may find themselves having a lateral flow test as the first line of defence, and only those people who test positive go on to need a PCR test.
Thank you. Moving on to vaccinations. Vaccinations have obviously started for 12 to 15-year-olds, and you say that the feedback from vaccination centres is positive. Do we know how many in that group have had the vaccine so far? And also, what would you say to parents and children who have reservations about that and are worried about having the vaccine?
We don't have numbers from this week because it is the first week, really. We waited a couple of weeks to allow families to have those conversations and to take clinical advice where they thought that was necessary. So as I said, what I was reporting was the feedback we've had from the vaccination centres themselves, that numbers have been good and lots of people have been coming forward. We will start collecting the numbers, and just as we have now began to report the numbers for 16 and 17-year-olds, we'll get to a place where it's possible to report numbers for 12 to 15-year-olds as well. But this is the first week and we're not at that point yet. My advice to any family is to talk it through. There isn't a government position that says to you, you should go and get it. We think that it does offer a defence. We think that the balance of arguments, as the chief medical officers have said, is in favour of taking up the offer. But I think it is very much a matter for parents and their young people to think it through for themselves. If they're in any doubt, they can get advice from people who run the vaccination centres. I think most people will decide to take the help that vaccination offers. But I think it's a matter of people talking it through in their own circumstances rather than me trying to offer them advice from the platform here this afternoon. Abby, thank you very much. Over to Jordan Howell at LBC.
Thank you, First Minister. You mentioned the demand for PCR tests. There's been discussions about charging for them elsewhere. Can you rule out today that we will never be charged for an NHS PCR test in Wales?
No plans at all to charge for PCR tests over this winter. Jordan, after the winter, you'll see in the plan that we say that we're going to have to begin to move into an era as coronavirus just becomes part of the way we have to manage our lives, as we manage with measles or we manage with the flu, where mass testing of the sort we have today will play a less important part in the way we manage the virus. And we will be reserving the tests for the purposes for which they are most important. But I can say, as far ahead as we have plans, there will be no charges for PCR tests in Wales.
Thank you. And on COVID passes, if I may, the Welsh Secretary, Simon Hart, was on LBC earlier this week. He said that people attending nightclubs essentially could say, I'm fully vaccinated without actually showing physical proof. We've already talked about lateral flow tests. If people decide to falsify a result, perhaps. Is what Simon Hart says correct, that people will be able to essentially just say they're fully vaccinated and be let into the club?
No, I'm afraid the Secretary of State simply has got hold of the wrong end of the stick there. You have to, if you're fully vaccinated, you have to be able to put that information in a verifiable way into the COVID pass. And the COVID pass demonstrates that you genuinely are doubly vaccinated. You can't just turn up and say so. You've got to have applied for your pass online or in writing, and in order to get it, the system verifies that you are indeed doubly vaccinated. Thank you very much. Finally today to Steve Bagnall at the Daily Post.
Thank you, First Minister. Going back to the issue of vaccine, there have been recent reports of teachers in Wales receiving threats from anti-vaccine campaigners following the rollout of the vaccine to 12 and 15-year-olds. How do you respond to this?
Well, my main response, of course, is to condemn the people who make those threats. There are examples, Steve, as you've seen, of some organised campaigns in which some schools have been targeted by anti-vaccine campaigners. The good news is that they do not persuade the vast majority of people in Wales. You've seen the very high levels of vaccination that we have in the Welsh population. Anybody who thinks that they are entitled to threaten somebody else for simply going about their ordinary everyday responsibilities really has completely lost a sense of proportion here. People are entitled to their views, they're entitled to express them. They're certainly not entitled to threaten anybody else.
Thank you, First Minister. We've heard previously about restrictions possibly being reintroduced if needed to combat COVID, particularly if there's an increase in hospitalisations. But if Wales were to, say, have a bad flu season, could that see the Welsh Government having to impose restrictions to take the pressure off the health service?
Well, we're very used to dealing with the flu, for the whole of devolution. I remember there being winter flu plans and vaccination campaigns and so on. And we've had some very difficult flu seasons over the period of devolution, with many thousands of people falling ill. We've never had to take the sort of measures we had to take because of coronavirus. So no, I don't think the two things are a parallel, and we wouldn't expect, for flu reasons, to need to have the sorts of stringent restrictions that we saw earlier this year or earlier in the course of the coronavirus pandemic. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you all very much indeed.